Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa Marie and Joji. Welcome back to the Deconstructed Woman podcast. This week, Joji and I sat down she had come across an article on the new movie Elemental by Disney and Pixar, and it struck a chord for a number of reasons. I had recently watched it with my kids, and really, I think that what I'd like to do is kind of go over, the premise of the movie without ruining it for any of you out there who want to see it. It is streaming live now on Disney Plus. But I think that it had a lot of elements that I think strike a chord for both of us. And so I wanted to sit down and kind of have a discussion. So for those of you who maybe haven't seen the movie, it's about a girl named Ember who is a fire element, and her parents have immigrated, for lack of a better term, from the fire island to Element City. And so they're adjusting to, the new environment where there's all the different elements, not just fire, but fire, water, air, and earth. And she works her way up to taking over the store that her father had built from the ground up when they immigrated. And so I think that this has a lot of ties to families who have immigrated, but also talks to the point of, as children, we typically have, our parents have goals that they have for us. They have aspirations and dreams, and they want to, ensure that we can get to those things. And I think a lot of times we try to live up to them, but we also, may find our own path. And so that really is sort of the soul searching adventure that Amber goes on as she's trying to figure out what does she want in life, to follow in the footsteps of her parents or branch out and do something different. And so I, again, won't spoil the movie for you, but I think that, again, it has a lot of elements that kind of speak to, for those of us who have grown up, whether your parents have immigrated here or not, I think that there's just a lot of elements of that speak to us. So, Joji, I know that you said that this spoke to you in some ways, and so kind of hand it over to you for a moment just to kind of jump in. And I know that you had recently read the article that kind of sparked this conversation as well.
Thanks, Alyssa. The commentary by Tracy Brown from the Los Angeles Times was in the Chicago Tribune the weekend of July 23rd, 2023. And when I read the article, the caption got my attention, which was "Elemental Reminder to Thank Our Parents." And as an immigrant, first generation to the US, I think that a lot of immigrant families go through this kind of a scenario where, parents sacrifice a lot to come to a new country. And then there are expectations for what they hope that their children will accomplish because of the sacrifices they've made to leave their country of origin or a comfortable lifestyle for something different. And I think, as personally for me, being bicultural, then you're torn between the dreams and hopes of your family and where you came from, but also then sort of the American dream for me, which is living to your own potential and finding your dream and pursuing it. And at the same time, now in my 50s, as I've raised my daughter, and I can see the full cycle of what has happened in my family, I'm also deeply grateful for my parents and the sacrifices they did make, regardless of if I was living up to their dreams or not, because ultimately, I think we got to a place where they were happy with the choices I made, though it may not have been their original dream for me. So I feel like we went through that and we got to the other side. And that, I think, enriched the way that I raised my daughter, and trying not to push my agenda, but at the same time, giving her the guidance to be able to make smart decisions based on the sacrifices that any parent makes for their child. Like you said, Alyssa, whether you're an immigrant or not. So I know that you have a personal story about your family and how this relates to your life. Do you want to share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I'm also first generation here. My father immigrated, and what he essentially did is he built a restaurant from the ground up as well. And it was something that I grew up in. I grew up working there as a small child, worked there all through high school. Every time I came home for college, I'd work at the restaurant. And I mean, it's been really part of our family. I mean, the employees that he's had, some have been there for 40 plus years. And so it really just feels like it's part of our family culture. And my father is getting to the point where he would like to retire. And so I think when we were talking about it before, I said one of the saddest things is that I am 7.5 hours away from my family. And so I'm not able to take over the restaurant, even though I'm not in the restaurant business. My husband, being a chef, though, probably could have taken it over, maybe evolved it, something to that nature. But because we're not there, essentially, this is something that when my father decides to retire, it may not continue. That kind of legacy that he has developed. I mean, people know him nationwide. It's become really kind of a staple in the city that he lives in, but it's going to kind of, dissipate. And to me, that was very hard, but it also wasn't my dream to take over the business at any time. I went in a very different direction and, pursued my dreams and what I wanted to do. And my parents are, they told me they're very proud of what I'm doing. But I think now that my father is getting closer and closer to that retirement age, I'm thinking, oh, I wish somebody could step in and take over and really kindle and continue that business because it was such a significant part of my childhood and for so many other people as well. And so again, I think that's kind of that same dynamic of we try to figure out what's going to be best for us, but those traditions and those family things that happen for us, I mean, it really is hard to let go of them because it has become such an ingrained part of your family culture and who you see yourself and what you kind of always envisioned that it would always be there. And then at some point, it may not be. So that's my family story. But I think that that's probably why the movie resonated so much with me too, was just that concept kind of carrying through. And I think the name of the article that you cited, you were saying like showing thanks to your parents, and it's like how do you do that when you've kind of chosen a different path, and you hope that they're proud of you, but also probably there was some hope that somebody within the family was going to continue that legacy as well.
Right, and that's a little bit of a difference between your story and my story because in my family, they were not there was nothing I had to take over from them. It was really about fulfilling the promise of success, and that success was how they defined that. Whereas in your family, there is really a legacy of a family business that to continue that would be in many ways your father's legacy. And so I think that's where the struggle is for you, I can imagine. But I do think that the question you ask is really poignant in the sense of can you choose your own path and not disappoint them if you don't choose to do what they thought would be the ideal situation? And that's it's an emotional question and it's also extremely difficult to answer being involved in it as we both are in our different ways. What do you think, Alyssa?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just really it comes down to the question of, you know, if your path is different than what the expectations for it. I mean, I can think of like so many instances where uh not necessarily for myself, because I think I from a very early age knew exactly what I wanted to do. And my parents always encouraged me and never once said like, no, you know, maybe you want a different path. Like it was like, this is what I want to do. And they're like, okay, great. But I can think of a lot of my friends and family and other people who, even from very young ages, so like child athletes, for example, where, they're pursuing, like they're trying to hone in on their skills and pursue something because that's, will make their parents proud if they go to this particular college or they do this particular thing. But then, they just kind of veer off and it's like, everybody's kind of surprised, like, oh, that person did that instead of what we thought they would do. Like, those, they vote you uh, in high school, like in your yearbook, like most likely to go on to whatever, and so you kind of, people have this projected trajectory for you. And then sometimes you do kind of fall into that. And sometimes you don't, you go in a completely different direction. I think that it's a matter of soul searching of like, am I doing what truly makes me happy? Or am I just following, the path that was laid out for me, that now I'm just gonna kind of go through the motions because that was the expectation for me. Again, I think for me personally, I pursued exactly what I wanted to do, but again, moving away from my family, it was not something like, I mean, everybody was questioning me, like, why are you, not staying close to the family and being in the same city? And I was like, because I have to pursue my own dreams. And I know that this is going to create for me opportunities that I couldn't have here or probably wouldn't have here. And so I think that sometimes, we do have to make decisions that take us kind of a little bit off the beaten path, but really trying to make sure that, that matters to us at the end of the day.
Right. And I think that, our parents at some point as we go to college and we're pursuing a professional career, I think our parents give us that leeway because we're doing everything we're supposed to do. I think at some point though, they think that maybe we're going to join them in on their path, and maybe once we get to a certain point, maybe we'll realize that we should follow their recommendations because they know what's best for us. And I think that's somewhat challenging too, because I think once you start, like my parents didn't understand the way college work, right? So you declare a major and then you take more and more classes in the same major. I think at some point my parents thought, well, maybe I'm going to come back to something that they wanted from me. And so I do wonder for you, do you think, Alyssa, that your parents thought, well, maybe there was a way for you to do both things to pursue your professional goals as well as maybe in the future take over the family business? Do you think that they thought maybe there was a way for you to do both?
I think so I lived in the same city as my parents for about a little under 5 years. And again, it was never discussion that was ever talked about. It was never kind of, you know, something that I was like, "Oh, yeah, this is part of the plan, like the long-term plan." But, if we had stayed there, I think that maybe that would have been part of the discussion. Maybe not, maybe, because obviously that would have been my husband's decision because my career was, in a very different field and not related. But I mean, I think that we've also talked about, like, someday opening up a cafe and, like, just kind of leaving things, both of us, leaving our careers and kind of just having a mom and pop, like, coffee shop, like, that would be my ideal dream. And so, it could have morphed into that, but again, it was never, put upon me to feel that kind of pressure. Though again, as we're kind of moving towards, my dad has like I said, he had a franchise. So he had multiple restaurants, and has now gone down to one. Um and so there's just one freestanding one now. And it's like, goodness, like, again, when that goes, it's done. The legacy's done. And I think that sits it's very unsettling for me, but at the same time, it's not something that I'm like, "Oh, I'm just gonna up and, you know, send my whole family over there and, like, revive it." Like, it just feels like that's a trajectory for that particular business and that restaurant. But it was interesting because I actually a couple months ago had looked up, and I mean I think in some ways that's part of life. Because I looked up, like, I don't remember what prompted me to do it, but restaurants that have gone out of business. So we think about like all the restaurants, some of our childhood that are no longer in business. And I think that that's something that happens. It just, it's not something that anybody necessarily plans to, but things do change, things go out of business. And so I think that brought me some comfort in just knowing that, like, you know what, this is just the end of this legacy, but at the same time, maybe it's making room for the next best thing. So I think in some ways it wasn't put on me to necessarily take over, but at the same time, I've made peace with it as well.
I do remember as you're talking, one of the things that Dan and I have talked about is that, he worked for Motorola during the heyday of their company, and Motorola had a lot of success. And at some point in Dan's tenure there, Motorola's owner sort of passed the baton on to his son. And his son is a business type of person. So the father was an engineer and the son is a business person. And one of the things that Dan had said to me is that the son really didn't understand the business of engineering. He might have known he may have known business, but he didn't understand how to navigate engineering and sort of how, I guess, it's if it's in your like bones as a person, you have innovation at a level where you can foresee where the business might be going, where the technology might be going. And what the father brought to the table was that foresight about technology and maybe predicting where a futurist mentality is for a particular kind of product. Whereas the son did not have that. The son might have approached it purely from a business standpoint, but from an engineering standpoint, they were not able to compete with the other companies that were hungry and were really pivoting to different places. And, so I also think about family businesses and how sometimes, as much as you see what you were saying about how businesses can go out of business at times, there are also businesses that have a very strong part of our history, but that also declined because there was a significant change that happened that could not sustain the energy of that business. So I do feel like thinking about that allows me to consider, for you that maybe in 10 years from now, when things have settled down and whether, the business continues or it's sold to another group of people or whatever, you know, right now there's such a time of it's such a time of transition that it creates a lot of unrest for all the parties involved. And in several years from now, when things settle down, you may see a completely different experience with that. And so it's heightened right now because you're sort of, drawing to that time where some decisions have to be made. And that's what's creating that stress or tension. But once those decisions have been resolved, then I think things will settle down again. Do you think that that's sort of the natural path it's going to take, do you suspect?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think that it's definitely, it's always hard, like I said before, to let go of like a family culture or, something that has been so deeply ingrained in like what I imagine like my family identity is. And everybody knows like that's my dad's restaurant. And, again, it's one of those things, but I think that it's also an opportunity for, the next phase of my dad's life and the next phase for my parents and what that looks like for them. So, I mean, I think that it's just, it's one of those things again, kind of going back to the article and the concept of like, trying to fulfill the roles and the identity that your parents developed for you, but also being true to yourself and wanting to show thanks for, the guidance that they provide you, even though, it's not necessarily disrespect to not follow in the path that they set for you. It is at times more a reflection of, maybe they ingrained in you very strong characteristics or strong qualities like hard work and determination and independence. And I think that, those I would hope that, as much as I will have dreams and aspirations for my children, that I will recognize that if they do their own thing and they follow their own path, that in some ways that's what I wanted them to do. I wanted to encourage them to do what makes them happy. Like at the end of the day, that's all I want for them is that they be happy, even if they're doing something that, you know, maybe doesn't bring in very much money or maybe, seems kind of frivolous. Like that's fine. Whatever they want to do, as long as they're happy, I'm happy for them. And I think that that will be hard, but at the same time, it's also something that I think most parents want. And I know I quoted it like when we were talking, I quoted the end of the movie, which I won't do here in case somebody wants to go and see it. But there's a particular quote in the movie that like I lost it because it was just like, oh, that's so like it was a moment between the father and the daughter, and it was just like, "Oh my gosh," like, I feel that. But it is about letting letting your children do what they wanna do and pursue you know, what they decide they want for themselves, but at the end of the day, I think most of us just want our children or, those in our family that we care about to just be happy.
And I think that's where most parents and families get to, is that the greatest joy I think parents have is when they see that their children are truly happy and that they have accepted the choices that they've made. And I think that's the struggle I think my parents had for me in particular, and I can only speak about myself, is that I think they wanted me to not limit myself. And I did actually initially, the choices that I made, was to get a graduate degree and not earn a lot of money. And I think for them being somebody, being a family that came from humble beginnings, to couldn't wrap their heads around, well, why would you go and get a master's degree if you're not going to make as much money as we make now? Like, it doesn't make any sense. You're investing more in your education, but yet it's not going to yield you enough money to live independently or whatever. And I think that was something they just couldn't wrap their head around. And now that I'm a parent, I completely see where they came from. I mean, I did not hear them at that time because I didn't think they understood that this is what my passion was, and I couldn't think of doing anything else, and I didn't know how to do anything else. And so there was this feeling of, how do I help them understand that? And ultimately, I think what ended up happening is that I became very successful in my field. And so therefore they were able to see the promotions and they were able to see the growth that I was able to do and exceed the expectations of myself as well. And then they realized that, oh, you can be successful. And we didn't realize that all these things were possible. And so I do think that we got to a good place, but I completely can relate to my parents and a parent's desire for their kids, because I think you're ultimately thinking about, well, what happens after we're gone? Once we leave this earth, will our children be independent? Will they be able to take care of themselves? And I also empathize with your parents, Alyssa, because they've got this legacy, which, you could just step right in and you could take it over, and you've got 40, 50 years of history behind it and success, that on one hand is just such a natural thing to do. And they've given you this beautiful gift. And I think that's what our parents look at and say, well, why wouldn't this, if this is such an easy way to go, like, I've built this for you, just step in and take over it. And I think that's the rub for us kids, is that we want to get our own path and we want to develop our own selves, and we want to take the risks and have those risks pay off. And I think ultimately when we get there and we're all happy, I think our parents are really happy for us. But I do think that sometimes our parents misinterpret that when we are choosing our own path, whether you're successful or unsuccessful or going through some bumpy roads, that we're not grateful for everything they've done for our benefit. And I think that's the hardest part, because I never wanted my parents to think that I wasn't grateful. Though I think as I was pushing for my own goals, I probably came across as being very ungrateful, because basically I told them they didn't know who I was and I needed to make my own path and they didn't understand me. And so of course, now as an adult, as a parent, I can hear how in their minds that would have translated to, you don't respect me, you don't understand where I'm coming from and all the sacrifices I made. But I really did. but not if that only way I could prove that to them was to do exactly what they wanted. So I think that's the challenge. And now, since I've lost my parents, and thankfully, before both my parents passed, we were able to have conversations because I had spent 20, 25 years in my career, and they were able to see me be successful, and me being able to thank them for everything they did for me and to allow me to grow in the way that I needed to grow. And that acknowledging that that's not what they had wanted from me, but yet they were able to let me find myself in the way I needed to. And so I am very grateful. And I suspect, Alyssa, that you still have that path to walk. And there are some hard days, but that there are some beautiful days as well. And so I sort of wish you luck with that. But I just feel like your parents are a lot more accepting of where you were going and where you are today. And they're very proud of you and everything you've accomplished. And so it sounds like it'll be a little bit easier than I think some of the struggles I went through. But it'll still be I'm sure, some settling down and some of those transitions that can be uncomfortable for all parties involved, for sure.
Oh yeah, I think that it's definitely going to be some conversations in the future, but I definitely would agree. I think that they were very accepting and very much were, the encouragement was for me to do what I wanted to do. And like I said, from a very young age, I knew like this is what I'm going to do. And then I just followed that path and there really wasn't much discussion about it. But I think that really, I hope that people can relate to this conversation, not necessarily for, what some of our own experiences, but just like the concept of being able to follow your own path. And, that might look very different for a lot of different people, whether it was, we're talking about careers, but I think this also can translate to, who you pick for a partner or how how you live your life in different ways. We talked about, some of the differences in intergenerational, like when we did gift giving and heirlooms and what that looked like. And so I think that a lot of times it can look very different through the different generations, but it also has a lot of impact on, each generation and how they perceive things, like you were saying, but also, how that looks. And so I think that we each kind of follow our own path, but at the same time, we're creating our own reality of what we want our life to look like. And I think that it can either, coincide with what your family and friends had intended for you or be in complete conflict with that. But I think that hopefully, for each of you listening to us, that you are pursuing what speaks to you within your heart. And, I think that hopefully will fulfill those needs and help you there. So I think that's all I have to say, but I'll hand it over to you, Joji, and we'll probably end this and kind of go from there.
Yep. So thank you all for listening to another episode that has been extremely, I think, moving for Alyssa and I. And this topic was one that really grabbed at our heartstrings in terms of our gratitude towards our parents and everything that they have done to shape us and our lives. And so please drop us a comment. I know that there are people out there who are going to relate to this, and we'd love to hear from you in terms of your stories and your relationships and the choices that you've made. And, feel free to drop us an email at the deconstructedwoman@gmail.com or through the platform where this podcast is being promoted. And we just want to hear from you. And we're always anxious to see how much you relate to the topics that we speak to. So until next time, this is Joji and Alyssa signing off. Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you liked this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions? Or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.